Now that we've covered the basic stages of language acquisition, let's talk a little bit about how language development affects our educational attainment and our learning process. For example, phonological processing is something that we rely on heavily in the early elementary grades to teach children how to read. So it's sound symbol association, being able to identify the sounds that letters make, being able to blend them together or know which sounds are missing, as well as even putting it in writing as we begin to write words. So we want to sound them out and be able to encode and decode them proficiently. Now, phonological processing, as you can see, is an ability that changes rapidly in early life. If you're going from age 5 down here all the way up, somewhere around age 17, we don't even process phonologically anymore in terms of new sounds because our brains believe that it's heard all of the sounds of the English language by that point. In fact, there are only, depending on who you ask, somewhere between 38 to 52 different sounds in the English language. Most people peg it somewhere around 47, 48, somewhere in there. Maybe 44, I don't know. I'm not a speech path, but the research indicates that it's hard to kind of pin it down depending on how you define these particular sounds. But there's certainly no more than about 50 sounds, which means you've heard them millions, if not billions of times by the time you've reached age 17, 18, so that your brain just doesn't need to hear them anymore. In fact, past the age of about 11 or 12, acquisition of new sounds can become much more difficult. Now, that makes a lot of sense because in kindergarten, first grade, second grade, third grade, when we're young, we are using that phonological processing to learn to read. So everything seems to work well in that capacity. But in order to decode words, we need something more than just the ability to decode it. We need to understand what it is, which means we need vocabulary. Look at the growth curve for vocabulary, though, in comparison to phonological processing. Whereas phonological processing peaks around 17 or so, vocabulary doesn't peak until somewhere between the ages of 55 and 60. Yeah, that's right. We continue to learn language, and new words well into our older adult lifetimes. So you see, there's still hope for some of you out there, in case you were a little worried. So what does this mean? What this means is that vocabulary takes a long time to develop. It's not something that is as readily acquired. Now, certain vocabulary allows us to function at a minimal level. If you stop and think of how many words there are in the English language, the unabridged English Oxford Dictionary has, 750,000 words and word forms, root words and word forms. That's a lot, but there's still millions more technical names, slangs, regionalisms, vocabulary, proper nouns, and so on. New words are being created all the time. Old words are getting archaic and being dropped all the time. So it's hard to get them, to acquire them. It's not easy. And that's why we tend to only use approximately 2,000 different words in daily general conversation on a weekly basis. Now, I don't mean we only say 2,000 words. We use the same 2,000 words. We just repeat them often enough. Now, that makes sense. A 5-year-old coming to kindergarten has about a 2,200 word vocabulary. So it makes a lot of sense in terms of where we're going. But the problem is this: if your vocabulary is behind, then how well are you going to be able to learn to read, even if you can decode? You see, that's where we're headed with this. And this creates a problem in the learning process. To what extent? Well, take a look at these data here from a research study that I did here in the metropolitan New York area. And one child who was a late first grader, just about to go into second grade now, her letter word identification was, and dictation, which dictation is not written in a sense. It's all like oral, verbal kind of sounding, like, he is to she or he is to him as she is to blank, something like that. But anyway, she is doing quite well, 128 standard score, 104 and everything. But when you look at her actual vocabulary development, it's a 47, less than the first 0.1 percentile. So her language there isn't really as advancing as quickly as we might think. When you look at her composite scores in terms of reading, writing, or broad English ability, she looks quite good, 123, 104, 104. But it's misleading because when we look at her actual development, her ability to use language in service of learning, not merely speaking it and using it, her oral language score is a 65. And this is what we're up against. Children naturally perform in this manner. And when we go to test them cognitively or intellectually, we find the same thing. Their verbal IQs tend to be very low. Their performance IQs tend to be more average. And then we say, wow, there must be some kind of problem because their verbal or thinking skills continue to lag in development. No, yes, it is lagging, but not because they have a problem, but because of the nature of development. Now, how far behind can somebody be? Well, this same child could read these words. Now, I say read, but really that's probably not correct. She could identify them by sight. Because look at these words: great, become, might, shown, explain, question, special, capture, swallow. Many of them, if not all of them, cannot be actually spelled phonetically or decoded phonetically. Great would have to be griat, become would be becomee, right? Where's that silent E? Might, oh my God, and it would be mikt. Okay, you get the idea. So how is it that she's able to recognize them? Well, in English, because of the lack of regularity, English tends to be what we call an opaque language because of the lack of correspondence between the morphology, the way we write things, and the phonology, the way we say things. So that correspondence is only 50% at best if you include silent E. Whereas other languages like Spanish tend to be about 95% regular. Very few exceptions. The way you say things is the way that you write them. And the way you write them is pretty much the way you pronounce them. So she has developed simply good visual memory. This is what English learners will tend to do. They know what the word should be spelled like, and when they see it spelled that way, then they know how to say it. Of course, with synonyms, it might be more difficult. Words that are spelled exactly the same but might have different meanings or different pronunciation could cause difficulties. Now, in her, if we have her say words of objects that she might not have much familiarity with, look at how much difficulty she can have. Cat, sock, toothbrush. These are incidental common items that we don't generally teach about in school. So cat for her is gato. She grows up with her family calling it gato. And until somebody says these two things go together, then she might not be able to put cat together. Sock, toothbrush. Toothbrush doesn't exist in Spanish. Cepillo de dientes. You say it with 3 words. Brush of the tooth or brush for the teeth, right? Flashlight, another one that doesn't exist in Spanish. As close as you can get would be linterna, which is like lantern, or torcha, which is a Chicano word. Torch being the actual word for flashlight in British English, amazingly enough, right? Rocking chair, drum, and so on. So these are things that she doesn't have experience with, which shows you that her vocabulary will be necessarily behind. Likewise, her grammar. As I mentioned before, like with dictation, she can say him is to her as blank is to she. She can get the he out of that. But when you ask her to think about the language, engage in metalinguistic processes, more reasoning abilities, where you say something like, how are red and blue alike? She is unable to do that. She'll say an apple because she sees the red circle and thinks it's an apple. How are circle and square alike? It's a robot. Well, it looks like a robot because the circle's on top of the square, but it's not. How are plane and bus alike? Well, the plane is white and the bus is orange, which is true, but that's not the correct answer. And shirt and jacket, and I love this response. The shirt is for the people put, and the jacket is for the people don't get cold. It's her verbatim response. And she's right about all of that, but she gets 0 points because that's not what these things have in common. She doesn't have that capacity. And so when children are developing in school, we mistake their developmental language proficiency, that is, their ability to be age and grade appropriate, with their speaking proficiency. Sometimes even with their ability to communicate at a basic level. Remember, basic interpersonal communication skills is conversational language. This child has pretty high conversational language. She's not fully there yet, but she's very close to it. And when she has that, does that make her comparable to all other kids? The answer is no, it does not. And as you can see here, this green line represents her ability to think, to use her mental faculties without language being involved. It's quite average. But when she's asked to think and language is involved, she's unable to really do it. Okay? It depends on how much language a person has. And you would think that as they progress through these stages of language development and getting better and better, that their thinking is going to get better. And it does. but it doesn't continue to match their speaking ability. And unfortunately, as you're going to see, it doesn't actually continue to rise. It actually plateaus. And at one point, after about fourth grade, it actually begins to decline.